The birth of Kali, the goddess of destruction and liberation. In the beginning, there was a battle so violent that even the gods began to fear their own creation. The sky burned red, the air felt heavy, almost unbreathable, and the earth trembled beneath the weight of something that could no longer be contained. This was not just another war between forces of light and darkness. This was something deeper, something ancient, inevitable, and dangerously out of control. From the heart of that chaos, from a place where divine power had reached its breaking point, something emerged. Not gently, not with grace, but with a force so raw that it felt like the universe itself had cracked open. She was not born from love, nor from harmony. She did not come as a protector in the way the gods understood protection. She came as something far more terrifying, and far more necessary. She was born from fury. A fury that had been building, accumulating silently beneath the surface of creation, waiting for the exact moment when balance could no longer be restored through peace. A force that did not negotiate, did not hesitate, and did not differentiate between what should remain and what needed to disappear. It simply moved forward, unstoppable, absolute. They would come to call her Kali, the Dark Mother, the devourer of time, the one who exists at the threshold where everything ends and something new begins. Her presence was not comforting. It was overwhelming. It was the kind of presence that forces you to look directly at what you've been avoiding, at everything you've been trying to control, suppress, or deny. But this is not just the story of a goddess emerging from divine wrath. It is not simply a myth about destruction, chaos, or fear. Beneath the surface, this story carries something much more unsettling and much more real. Because Kali was not created to destroy the world. She was created to destroy what should never have existed in the first place. And once she began, once that force was unleashed without restraint, even the gods, beings of immense power and wisdom, realized something that had never crossed their minds before. They might not be able to stop her. Long before Kali emerged, before the sky turned red and the battlefield trembled under the weight of something uncontrollable, there was an imbalance growing quietly within the universe. It did not begin with chaos, but with excess. Power, when left unchecked, had begun to concentrate in the hands of beings who no longer respected the natural order. These were the Asuras, powerful entities often described as demons, but not evil by nature, rather consumed by ambition, ego, and an insatiable hunger for dominance. Among them rose two figures whose names would echo across realms, Shamba and Nishamba. They were not merely strong. They were strategic, relentless, and driven by a belief that the universe itself was something to be conquered. Through penance and discipline, they had gained immense power, enough to challenge the gods themselves. And when that power was granted, as it often is in these ancient stories, it came with a condition, one that would ultimately shape everything that followed. They could not be defeated by any man. At first, it seemed like a gift, a perfect protection. But like many boons granted in the cosmos, it carried within it the seed of its own undoing. With this advantage, Shamba and Nishamba began their conquest. They defeated the gods, one by one, stripping them of their kingdoms, their weapons, and their place in the cosmic order. The heavens, once radiant and stable, fell into silence. The gods, who had once maintained balance, found themselves displaced, powerless, wandering without purpose. And with their fall, something deeper began to shift. Because when those who protect balance lose their power, imbalance does not remain static. It expands. The Asuras did not rule with wisdom. They ruled with control, with possession, with the constant need to prove their superiority. What had once been a structured universe began to feel heavy, distorted, suffocating. The natural rhythm of creation, birth, preservation, dissolution, was interrupted. Everything was being held, gripped too tightly, refusing to let go. And in that refusal, tension began to build. Desperate and stripped of their strength, the gods turned to the one force that existed beyond their individual powers. They turned to Shakti, the primordial feminine energy, the source from which all forms of power emerge. Not as a single goddess, but as the underlying force that gives life, sustains it, and ultimately transforms it. From their collective despair, from their surrender, something extraordinary happened. A radiant form began to take shape. She was Duga. Not born in the traditional sense, but manifested, formed from the combined energies of all the gods. Each one offered what little remained of their power, their weapons, their essence, their intention. And from that union, Dagor emerged not just as a warrior, but as a perfect embodiment of balance. She was calm, composed, and yet undeniably powerful. Where the Asuras ruled through excess, she stood in absolute alignment. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere. But the Asuras, blinded by their own sense of superiority, did not see her as a threat. They saw her as something to possess. Shamba and Nishamba sent messengers, not with weapons, but with proposals. They had heard of her beauty, her power, her presence, and they desired to claim her, to make her theirs, as they had done with everything else. It was not enough to rule the heavens. They needed to own even the force that could challenge them. Dagor listened. And then she refused. Not with anger, not with aggression, but with a clarity that cut deeper than any weapon. She declared that she would only belong to the one who could defeat her in battle. It was not a negotiation. It was a truth. What followed was inevitable. The battlefield was prepared. The tension that had been building across realms now had a direction, a form, a point of collision. The armies of the Asuras gathered, vast and relentless, fueled by arrogance and certainty. Dagor stood alone, radiant and still, holding within her the combined force of creation itself. At first, the battle seemed almost balanced. Dagor moved with precision, grace, and an effortless mastery that reflected her origin. She defeated generals, shattered formations, and dismantled wave after wave of attackers. But the Asuras were not easily overcome. For every one that fell, another seemed to rise, more aggressive, more determined. And then came Raktabija, a being unlike the others. A warrior whose very existence defied the logic of battle. Every drop of his blood that touched the ground gave rise to another version of himself, equally powerful, equally unstoppable. The more he was attacked, the more he multiplied. Violence did not weaken him. It fed him. Dagor fought with everything she had. But something became clear. This was not a battle that could be won through control. This was not a force that could be managed, contained, or negotiated with. And in that moment, when strategy reached its limit, when balance alone was no longer enough, something shifted within Dagor. Something deeper. Something darker. Something that had always been there, but had never been fully unleashed. And that is the moment, just before Kali was born. The battlefield had reached a point where logic no longer applied. What had begun as a war between forces now felt like an unraveling of reality itself. The air was thick with dust and heat, the ground soaked with the residue of endless combat, and in the center of it all stood Dagor, still radiant, still powerful, but facing something that could not be defeated in the way all battles had been fought before. Raktabija advanced without fear. Every strike against him only made him stronger. Every wound multiplied his presence. Each drop of his blood that touched the earth gave birth to another version of him, identical in strength, identical in fury. The battlefield was no longer filled with enemies. It was being consumed by them. What was once one had become many, and what was many was becoming infinite. Dagor fought with precision, with intelligence, with mastery, but mastery was no longer enough. Because this was not just an enemy. This was a principle. A force that thrived on reaction, on opposition, on resistance itself. The more it was attacked, the more it expanded. The more it was resisted, the more it took form. It was as if the very act of fighting it was feeding its existence. And then, something changed. In that moment, when even divine control reached its limit, Dagor did not reach outward for more power. She went inward. Something within her began to rise. Not calm, not composed, not balanced, but raw, untamed, absolute. A force that had always existed beneath the surface of order, waiting for the moment when order alone could no longer sustain the world. Her expression shifted. Her stillness broke. And from the center of her being, from her forehead, according to the ancient tellings, a new presence erupted into existence. Kali. She did not emerge gently. She did not descend from the heavens. She burst forth, dark, fierce, unstoppable, like a crack in reality itself. Her skin was as black as the void, not reflecting light but absorbing it. Her hair fell wild and unbound, moving like living energy. Around her neck hung a garland of skulls, not as decoration, but as a reminder of time, of mortality, of everything that eventually dissolves. Her eyes burned with something beyond anger. It was clarity. A clarity that sees through illusion without hesitation. A clarity that does not negotiate with what is false. The battlefield fell silent for a fraction of a moment, not because the war had stopped, but because something far more terrifying than the war itself had just appeared. Callie did not wait. She moved. Not with strategy, not with calculation, but with pure, direct action. Where Dugard had fought with precision, Callie fought with inevitability. She rushed into the masses of Raktabija's clones, her presence cutting through them like a force of nature that could not be resisted. And then she did something no one else had done. She changed the rules of the battle. Instead of striking and allowing the blood to fall, Callie began to consume it. With every blow, with every wound she inflicted, she drank the blood of Raktabija before it could touch the ground. She devoured the very source of his multiplication. What had once been his power, his ability to replicate through destruction, was now being neutralized at its origin. The battlefield shifted. For the first time, Raktabija was no longer expanding. He was being contained. Callie moved faster, deeper, more intensely. She was no longer just fighting him. She was absorbing him, dismantling him at the level where he existed. Every drop of blood she consumed was not just a victory. It was the end of a possibility. The end of another version of him being born. And slowly, inevitably, the infinite began to collapse. Raktabija weakened. His endless multiplication came to an end. His presence, once overwhelming, began to shrink under the force of something that did not resist him, but ended him completely, until there was nothing left. But the battle did not end there. Because Callie did not stop. What had been unleashed was not just a solution to a problem. It was a force beyond control, beyond intention. The same intensity that had destroyed Raktabija now turned outward, moving through the battlefield with unstoppable momentum. The Asuras fell one after another, not through strategy, but through sheer annihilation. Her dance began. A dance of destruction so absolute that it no longer distinguished between what needed to end and what could remain. The gods watched. Dugard watched. And for the first time since the beginning of the war, a new realization began to form, not about the enemy, not about the battle, but about Callie herself. Because what had been called forth to restore balance was now threatening to consume everything. At first, it felt like victory. Raktabija was gone. The impossible had been undone. The force that multiplied through resistance had finally met something that did not resist it, but ended it at its source. The battlefield, once overflowing with infinite versions of the same enemy, had begun to clear. The gods, who had watched in growing desperation, felt something they had not felt in a long time. Relief. But it did not last. Because Callie did not stop. What had been unleashed was not a controlled force, not a measured response to imbalance. It was something far more primal. A current that, once set in motion, did not ask where to end. Her energy surged through the battlefield, expanding outward, consuming everything in its path. The Asuras fell, one after another, their armies collapsing under the sheer intensity of her presence. But the line between enemy and existence itself began to blur. Her movements became wilder. Her breath heavier. Her laughter, if it could even be called that, echoed through the battlefield like a sound that did not belong to this world. It was not joy. It was not anger. It was something deeper, the sound of dissolution itself. Callie had entered her dance. A dance not of celebration, but of total annihilation. Each step shook the ground. Each movement carried the weight of something ancient, something inevitable. She was no longer responding to the battle. She had become the end of it. And the end was spreading. The gods began to understand what was happening. This was not just destruction of the enemy. This was destruction without discrimination. The same force that had restored balance was now dissolving the very structure of reality that balance depended on. Mountains trembled. The sky seemed to fold into itself. The rhythm of existence, creation, preservation, dissolution, was collapsing into a single overwhelming movement. Destruction. Pure, Unstoppable destruction. Dugo watched. She understood. More than anyone else, she knew what Kali was. She knew that this force had not come from outside, it had emerged from within. Kali was not separate. She was an aspect, a truth, a dimension of the same energy that sustains the universe. And yet, in her unleashed form, she had gone beyond intention. This is the paradox. The force that liberates can also consume everything. The gods turned to one being, Shiva, the one who sits at the edge of existence, the one who meditates beyond creation and destruction, the only one who could meet Kali not with resistance, but with presence. Because nothing else would work. Not force. Not control. Not opposition. Only stillness. Shiva did not arrive with weapons. He did not come to fight. He did not come to stop Kali in the way one stops an enemy. He came to meet her, exactly as she was. And then, without warning, he did something that no one expected. He lay down. Directly in her path. Kali, lost in the intensity of her dance, did not see him at first. Her movement continued, fierce, unstoppable, absolute. And then, in a single step, her foot came down onto Shiva. The moment froze. Not in time, but in awareness. Because in that instant, something shifted. Kali looked down. And for the first time since her emergence, she saw. Not an enemy. Not something to destroy. But consciousness itself. Still, unmoving, completely present. Shiva did not resist her. He did not push back. He did not try to control her. He simply was. And that was enough. In that moment, Kali became aware of herself. Of what she had become. Of the force she had unleashed. Of the line she had crossed, not between good and evil, but between balance and excess. Her expression changed. The intensity did not disappear, but it transformed. The unstoppable movement paused. The dance slowed. And in a gesture that has been depicted for centuries, she extended her tongue, not as a symbol of hunger or violence, but as a moment of realization. A moment of shock, of awareness, of recognition. The destruction stopped. Not because it was defeated, but because it was seen. This is the moment that defines Kali. Not her rage. Not her power. But her awareness. Because Kali is not just destruction. She is the force that destroys illusion. The force that cuts through everything false, everything unnecessary, everything that clings beyond its time. But when that force loses awareness, it becomes something else. It becomes chaos without purpose. And that is what Shiva restored. Not by stopping her but by reminding her. The battlefield fell silent. The asuras were gone. The imbalance had been corrected. But something deeper had also been revealed, something that went beyond the story itself. That destruction is not the opposite of creation. It is part of it. And when it is aligned, it liberates. But when it is unconscious, it consumes everything. Kali stepped back. The dance ended. But her presence did not disappear. Because Kali does not vanish once the battle is over. She remains. At the edge of every transformation. At the threshold of every ending. In every moment where something must fall apart for something else to emerge. Not as an enemy, but as a truth that cannot be avoided. And from that moment on, she was no longer just feared. She was understood. As both the destroyer and the liberator. After that moment, after her foot touched Shiva, after awareness returned and the dance came to a halt, the battlefield did not immediately return to peace. There was a silence, yes, but it was not empty. It was a silence filled with presence, with the echo of everything that had just been destroyed and everything that had been revealed. Kali stood still. The same force that moments before had been unstoppable now existed in complete awareness. Her breath slowed. Her gaze softened, not in weakness, but in clarity. The energy that had erupted as uncontrollable destruction was still there, just as powerful, just as absolute, but now it was aligned. This is the key transformation. Kali did not disappear after the battle. She did not return to nothingness or dissolve back into Dagon as if she had only been a temporary manifestation. Instead, she remained, as a conscious force within the cosmic order. Because what she represents is not something that can vanish. After the fall of Raktabija and the defeat of the Asuras, the balance of the universe was restored. The gods regained their positions, the heavens reopened, and the natural rhythm of existence, creation, preservation, and dissolution, began to flow once again. But this time, something had changed. There was a new understanding. The gods had witnessed a force that went beyond their own capacities. They had seen what happens when destruction is not just a tool, but a principle of existence. And they understood that Kali was not simply a weapon they could call upon when needed. She was something far more fundamental. From that point forward, Kali came to be recognized as one of the deepest expressions of Shakti, the primordial feminine energy. Not as the gentle, nurturing aspect that sustains life, but as the aspect that ends it when the time comes. The one that removes what is false, what is stagnant, what has outlived its purpose. Her role became clear. Kali stands at the threshold of transformation. Where something must end, she is there. Where illusion has taken root, she cuts through it. Where attachment binds, she severs. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because without dissolution, nothing new can emerge. Without destruction, there is no space for truth. In many traditions, she is also seen as the force of time itself, Kala, devouring everything that is born. Not as a punishment, but as an inevitability. Everything that arises will pass. Everything that takes form will dissolve. Kali is that process, made conscious. But there is another layer. Kali is not only a cosmic force. She is also internal. After her awakening, her presence was not limited to battlefields or divine realms. She became a symbol, and more than a symbol, an active force, within human experience. She represents the moment when something inside you can no longer be sustained. When identities collapse. When illusions break. When the version of yourself that you have been holding on to must end. And this is why she is both feared and revered. Because to encounter Kali is to face truth without filters. To lose what you thought you needed. To be stripped of what is not real. But at the same time, it is to be freed from everything that was limiting you. Liberation, through destruction. That is her function. In temples and traditions across India, Kali is worshipped not only as a fierce goddess, but as a mother. A paradox that only makes sense when you understand her role. Because a mother does not only nurture, she also protects, and sometimes, she removes what threatens the life of what she loves. Kali does the same. She destroys the ego, the illusion, the attachment that keeps consciousness bound. And in doing so, she opens the possibility of something deeper, something more real. This is why, after her awakening, Kali was not feared as a force to be avoided. She was honored as a force to be understood. Not because she is safe, but because she is necessary. She remains, even now, in every ending that leads to a beginning. In every collapse that reveals truth. In every moment where something within you breaks, not to harm you, but to free you. Kali did not come to destroy the world. She came to destroy what keeps you from seeing it clearly. And that is the role she continues to hold. If you only see Kali as a goddess of destruction, you're missing the point. Because nothing in this story was random. Nothing unfolded without meaning. Every moment, from the rise of the Asuras to the birth of Durga to the uncontrollable emergence of Kali, reveals something deeper than mythology. It reveals a pattern. A pattern that exists not just in the universe, but within you. Kali is not only a force that appears in distant cosmic battles. She appears in your life in ways that are far more subtle, but just as powerful. Not with weapons or armies, but through moments where everything seems to fall apart. Moments where something ends without warning, where something you were holding on to disappears, where the version of yourself you believed in no longer makes sense. And in those moments, it feels like destruction, like loss, like chaos, like something has gone wrong. But what if it hasn't? What if that collapse is not the problem, but the process? Because Kali does not destroy randomly. She destroys what is no longer true. She removes what you've outgrown. She cuts through illusions you've been unconsciously protecting. She breaks structures that can no longer sustain who you are becoming. And yes, it feels intense. It feels uncomfortable. Sometimes it even feels unfair. But that is only because we don't see the full picture. We see the loss, but not the space it creates. We feel the ending, but not what is trying to emerge through it. This is the paradox of Kali. The same force that terrifies you is the one that can free you. But only if you stop resisting it. Because just like Raktabija, the more you fight what needs to end, the more it multiplies. The more you try to hold onto something that is already collapsing, the more suffering it creates. And the moment you allow it, the moment you stop trying to control everything, something shifts. Not outside, but inside. That is where Kali does her real work. She does not ask you to be comfortable. She does not ask you to stay the same. She asks you to see clearly, to let go, and to trust that what is falling away was never meant to stay forever. And that what remains is closer to the truth. So the next time something in your life begins to break, don't rush to fix it immediately. Pause. Observe. Ask yourself if what you are experiencing is destruction or liberation. Because sometimes, what feels like the end of everything is actually the beginning of something real. If this story made you see things differently and you want more stories like this, stories that don't just tell you what happened but show you what it means, make sure to subscribe. Because the next story might not just be a story. It might be something you've been living without realizing it.